So can she tell the House whether she told the Treasury Permanent Secretary that Ian Caulfield had made a donation to her before she got him appointed as a director in the Treasury? Yes or no?
Yes.
All governments appoint people to the civil service. The donation from Ian Caulfield was declared over a year ago in the proper way, and we answered all the questions in the right way that the civil service asked when we made that appointment. Ian Caulfield is supporting this government in hosting the International Investment Summit, which is going to bring hundreds of global investors to the UK next month.
I think that means the answer is no. And the Ministerial Code states that ministers must ensure that no conflict arises or could reasonably be perceived to arise between their public duties and their private interests, financial or otherwise. That did not happen. So will she tell the House why is cronyism wrong under the Conservatives but acceptable under Labour?
I think they've got a bit of brass neck criticising this government after the appointments and the partying at Downing Street that we saw under the last Conservative government, and billions of pounds of contracts handed out to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. That's why this government are appointing a COVID corruption commissioner to get that money back from taxpayers, because unlike the last government, we are determined that taxpayers' money is treated with respect and not handed out to donors of the party.
Mr. Speaker, Age UK report that there are around 1 million pensioners who just miss out on the winter fuel payment. These are people living on modest incomes within £50 of the poverty line who will miss out due to a tiny occupational pension, including many in Liverpool Wavertree. We have heard about the campaign to take up pension credits, but can my right honourable friend tell us specifically whether that pension credit will be backdated?
Yes, absolutely. Pension credit can be backdated by up to 3 months, and we will ensure that happens. We are also working closely with Liverpool City Council to ensure that constituents in Liverpool Wavertree and indeed in all of our constituencies are getting the support that they are entitled to. The poorest pensioners who are entitled to pension credit should get it. It's a travesty that 800,000 missed out under the last Conservative government. We will ensure that pensioners entitled to support get it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's estimated the Bank of England will require a further £110 billion of taxpayer subsidy to cover long bond sale losses through to 2030. So why is the Chancellor clobbering pensioners to save £1.5 billion a year when she could be challenging the Bank of England to save tens of billions of pounds a year?
Well, before I became a Member of Parliament, I was an economist at the Bank of England, and I respect the independence of the Bank of England. The previous government undermined that independence. That contributed to the economic chaos we saw under the last Conservative government. This government will never go down that route.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Chancellor of the Exchequer confirm that her decisions are targeted at winning new investment in green industry in places such as Billingham in my constituency?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I also welcome him to this House because he brings a great deal of expertise on green steel from his previous career. And indeed, part of the plans of this government to launch the National Wealth Fund is precisely to create investment across the country in some very important strategic industries, and decarbonisation of steel and the steel industry is one of those.
Nicosia Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the prospect of the financial collapse of a major utility company like Thames Water should cause us all grave concern. Not only what it would mean for consumers in my constituency and many like it, but the wider implications it will carry for our economy and the government finances. Would the Chancellor therefore agree with me that putting Thames Water into special administration now and reforming it would not just protect consumers, including my constituents, but will protect the wider economy?
Water companies are commercial entities. It would therefore not be appropriate for me to comment on it today, and it's for the company and its investors to resolve their possible issues.
Josh Newbley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For decades, members of the My Workers Pension Scheme in Cannock Chase and across the country have seen billions go to successive governments. With an average of 19 scheme members passing away every day, the resolution cannot come too soon. So can I ask the Treasury what progress has been made on transferring the government's share of the MPS investment reserve to scheme members?
This was an issue that I championed in the last Parliament as chair of the committee, and I'm pleased to confirm that I'm working with colleagues across government to make progress and will update the House further in due course.
Lisa Smart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stories of crumbling public infrastructure are all too common. Stepping Hill Hospital in Hazel Grove has had to close buildings because the condition was no longer deemed safe, and we've seen footage of medics having to wade through flooded corridors when pipes have burst. The allocated capital money simply cannot cover the repairs backlog. How will the Chancellor ensure that hospitals like Stepping Hill can access the capital investment they need, both to repair crumbling buildings and to deliver additional sites where needed?
The Government is reviewing the new hospitals programme as part of our spending review. We will undertake a full and comprehensive review whilst continuing to deliver the most advanced and most urgent hospitals in a realistic timeframe.
Ruth Cabré.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The letter from the Cabinet Secretary to the former Chancellor that emerged this morning clearly stated that the failure by the last government holding a spending review following the unexpected national and global pressures significantly contributed to the fiscal challenge that the Labour government inherited. What can the Chancellor learn from this?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The party opposite crashed the economy and then wrecked the public finances, leaving us with a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. The Shadow Chancellor isn't willing to be straight about the damage that he did and is now trying to pass the buck to independent civil servants. I will always be honest about the public finances and take the tough decisions that we need to fix the foundations of our economy.
Gareth Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In July, borrowing stood at £3.1 billion, well ahead of the OBR's forecast of £0.1 billion. Does the Chancellor agree that she could have actually reduced the level of the national debt had she chosen not to reward her trade union paymasters by spending £10 billion in inflation-busting pay rises?
Yeah. Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, the government borrowing is running at £4.7 billion higher than the OBR forecast because the previous government made unfunded commitments without any idea of how they were going to be paid for. The previous government set the mandate for the independent pay review bodies, and we have honoured the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies to ensure that our armed forces, our police officers, and our nurses and our teachers got a pay rise. I think that is the right thing to do. If he doesn't, I don't wonder how he justifies that to public sector workers in his constituency.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister share my concerns about reports of the trade union victimisation at the HMRC's Benton Park View office in Newcastle, where 3 PCS reps have already been dismissed and more face live disciplinary proceedings? I'm pleased to welcome those 3 reps to Parliament today. Will the Minister agree to meet with them and the PCS about this worrying situation?
I thank my honourable friend for her question, and as government ministers we greatly value and respect trade unions and the work of trade union representatives in supporting their members. Whilst it's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases, I will look into this matter further and respond to my honourable friend in due course.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's decision to cut the winter fuel payment is forecast to save £1.5 billion. Can she advise the House what other options she considered for making savings in the DWP budget before deciding to make this cut?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The black hole that we inherited was £22 billion, and we announced in the statement on July the 29th £5.5 billion worth of savings to reduce the size of that black hole. But the honourable gentleman can see that there is still work to be done, and we'll be setting out further measures in the budget on the 30th of October to get a grip of the public finances.
Joe Powell.
Mr. Speaker, a forthcoming Transparency International report has identified 28 contracts worth £4.1 billion that were awarded to parties with direct political connections to the party opposite. So can she update us on the progress of appointing the COVID Corruption Commissioner and whether they will take evidence from corruption campaigners like Transparency International?
We are appointing a fixed-term COVID fraud commissioner through an open competition that is now running as of this morning. The commissioner will make sure that everything is done to return money owed to the taxpayer. It will report to the Chancellor, working with the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and will report to Parliament in due course.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The economic potential of the Brigg and Immingham constituency in the wider Humber region is heavily dependent on the renewable energy sector. However, there is a cloud on the horizon with the future of Scunthorpe Steelworks in doubt. Can the Chancellor give an assurance that if there are redundancies at Scunthorpe, there will be a generous package of support for workers and investment through the local authority to redevelop the area?
The honourable gentleman speaks powerfully about the huge opportunities at Immingham and on the whole East Coast in terms of renewable energy, as well as in carbon capture and storage. Part of the National Wealth Fund is to invest in industries like carbon capture and storage, but also in our crucial steel sector, which is important to so many of the other government ambitions about growing our economy. We're determined to support the steel sector through that investment with the National Wealth Fund.
Jane Kirkham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor's plans for growth are welcome to Cornwall. In the meantime, we're relying upon Shared Prosperity Fund and Town Steel money. The deadlines for completion of those schemes are March 25 and March 26. To ensure that that investment is not lost, will the Chancellor consider extending the deadlines for completion of those schemes for up to 12 months?
I thank my honourable friend for that question and welcome her to her place, and she speaks powerfully on behalf of the people of Cornwall too. The spending review will be the appropriate time to look at the shared prosperity funds and what resource we can give to the people of Cornwall, and I'm sure that my honourable friend will work with the relevant Secretaries of State to ensure that those representations are heard.
Dave Doolan.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor would have known in advance of the cut to winter fuel payment and stripping £160 million from pensioners in Scotland that Scottish pensioners suffer the lowest temperatures. Rural Scottish pensioners live in some of the oldest houses on these islands, and most Scottish pensioners in rural areas are off the gas grid. So knowing that, can she tell us what discussions did she have with her 37 new Scottish Labour MPs about pushing Scottish pensioners into fuel poverty?
Well, I would just note that the Scottish Government have decided to mirror what the wider UK Government is doing rather than using the tax powers that the Scottish Government have. That's a decision that the Scottish Government have made given the fiscal situation that they face. We face a similar issue with a £22 billion black hole in the public finances.
Sean Davis.
I welcome the plans of this government to get Britain building again with a commitment to build 1.5 million homes across our country. There is also 1 million homes that councils have given planning consent to. Those with skin in the game need help and support to get those houses unblocked. What steps will the government make in that regard?
I thank my honourable friend for that question and welcome him to his place. As a former local government leader, he knows the huge opportunities that there are to build the homes that our country desperately needs. We've made a commitment to build 1.5 million homes during the duration of this Parliament. That will require making decisions to call in planning decisions, as we already have done in the first week in office with 4 specific housing developments.
Thousands of pensioners in my Aldridge Brown Hills constituency have worked hard all their lives and now worried at the prospect of losing their winter fuel payment upon which they rely. Will the Right Honourable Lady reconsider and reverse her decision?
Well, the increases in the basic state pension mean that constituents of hers are £900 better off than they were a year ago. And of course, energy bills are lower this year than they were last year. But it is important that we ensure that the 800,000 people who missed out on pension credit under the previous Conservative government now get access to that support, because those are the poorest pensioners. And at the moment, they are living in poverty because the previous government failed to sign them up to pension credit.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Chancellor and her team whether, as departments are preparing their spending review submissions, whether she would consider allowing the international development budget to be on the same footing as the R&D budget and look at it over 10 years so we can get back to that 0.7, and whether she'd be willing to meet with me and a delegation to discuss the benefits of such an approach to such an important budget.
The government spending review is currently underway. All decisions on ODA spending will be taken in the round as part of that process, and I'd be delighted to meet with my honourable friend and her colleagues to discuss this very issue.
Right, we'll let the front benches change over. All the best. Right, we now come to the urgent question. Dame Harriet Baldwin.
To ask the Foreign Secretary if he will make a statement on the political and humanitarian situation in Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like first to welcome the Right Honourable Lady to her place. Of course, as former African Minister, I know that she's deeply concerned about these issues. I'm very grateful for the fact that this urgent question has been brought. It could not be, indeed, more urgent. Last month, Mr. Speaker, I visited South Sudan to assess the situation in Sudan and to meet those who've been forced to flee horrendous violence. The scenes of suffering and devastation that I heard about from families that have been torn apart, children who were on the brink of starvation, have been etched in my memory. We now have confirmation that the senseless war between the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces has brought famine to Sudan. In northern Darfur's Zamzam IDP camp, which hosts over 500,000 people, 100 people are dying from starvation every day. But we have to be clear that these conditions exist across Sudan. We should be discussing a more damning assessment today, but a sustained tactic of denying access to the hardest hit areas of the country is making many people and their suffering invisible. The famine facing Sudan is almost entirely man-made and a direct consequence of the deliberate efforts by both warring parties to block aid getting to those most in need. The warring parties must remember their obligations under international humanitarian law. Access must not be arbitrarily denied, and starvation must not be used as a weapon of war. The UK welcomes the decision to reopen the Adre border crossing for humanitarian assistance for 3 months. This move, if conducted in good faith, could save thousands of lives. The SAF must act to remove any unnecessary restrictions on trucks moving through Adre, and the RSF must urgently facilitate movement into areas under their control. Without this, life-saving aid will be blocked from accessing those most in need. Now, last month, I announced an additional £15 million of vital assistance to Sudan, South Sudan and Chad to support vulnerable people forced to flee violence and seek safety. With this announcement, the UK has almost doubled its ODA to Sudan to £97 million this financial year, most of which is vital humanitarian aid. The UK has also welcomed efforts by the US, Saudi Arabia and Switzerland to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table last month. But we remain deeply concerned that the SAF did not take the opportunity to act in the best interests of the people they claim to represent, refusing to attend the talks in person. The warring parties must do everything in their power to ensure that this wholly unjustified war must end immediately. We also continue to call upon the RSF to implement the commitments made in the Jeddah Declaration to protect civilians. We stand ready to support partners in following up on these talks, including using the UK's role as penholder on Sudan at the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. Yesterday, Parliament spent time on 2 terrible conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, but we must not allow this Parliament to forget about the increasingly dreadful situation in Sudan. And I welcome the Right Honourable Lady to her position. And I know that she has just come back from visiting South Sudan, and I welcome the focus that she is clearly putting on the situation. It is an absolutely urgent situation with 10 million people internally displaced. 4 million of them are children. 2 million have fled as refugees, and half the country's population of 47 million now needs food aid. 750,000 people are starving in a famine that has only been made worse by this recent flooding. So I want to urge the government to pay really urgent attention to this situation. We cannot lose the momentum and focus on resolving this conflict and on improving access for humanitarian aid. The UK is the penholder at the United Nations, and with Norway and the United States, we form the Troika, which can act as an interlocutor with the warring parties. What progress is being initiated to follow up on the unsuccessful effort recently, last month, to try and bring the Sudanese armed forces to the table. The US Special Envoy, Tom Perriello, has been working very hard on trying to make progress, but what role is the UK government playing? It's also very welcome that the Adre crossing has opened and that there is now some improvement in humanitarian access, but the UK again has a key role to play in bringing other donors together for Sudan. And what plans does the UK government have itself to convene other influential regional players like the African Union, like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, where our extensive and excellent diplomatic network can make such an important difference? And overall, what strategy does the UK government have to counteract the growing influence of Russia in the region, where they are fomenting these conflicts, both in Sudan and in nearby countries like Libya, in order to gain access to Red Sea and Mediterranean ports and encourage migration patterns such as those that we have seen?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady's commitment on these incredibly important questions. She talked about some of the figures around those who've been displaced. Well, indeed, Sudan currently is the world's largest displacement crisis in absolute terms. Of course, some of those individuals have been displaced before. I particularly talked when I was in South Sudan to those who had left South Sudan because it had been so unsafe, gone into Sudan and then been forced back into South Sudan once more. So this really is a horrendous crisis, and it's one that deserves international focus, and that is what we are determined to provide as a new UK government, of course recognising what took place previously under previous government as well. We want to ensure this crisis is given the attention that it deserves. That includes, of course, through being the penholder, as she rightly noted, at the UN, but also continuously urging those warring parties to come to the table and ensuring that the voices of civil society, of course, are not ignored here. That's been particularly important for the UK to make sure that we are actually convening those civil society actors. I met with some of them myself when I was in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. Clearly they're not able to operate in Sudan, many of them. It's too dangerous, but they're seeking still to make sure that voice of civil society, including women, is listened to. She talked about applying international pressure to partners, and just very briefly to finish in my response to her, I would say that of course is important positively when it comes to the work we can do together. So again, when I was in Addis, I met with the African Union, with Commissioner Bankole, to talk with him about what we could do together, ensuring that other regional actors are brought in to push forward peace and the ceasefire that's so desperately needed, the humanitarian access that's needed. But of course, there's also that negative issue of the other countries that are becoming involved in this conflict, that are worsening it. And the UK government is absolutely clear. Engagement with the warring parties in any measure that is not focused on humanitarian access or peace, that engagement will only prolong this devastating war, which is leading to so much death and destruction.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is one of the world's worst conflicts and humanitarian disasters, and sadly receives so little of our attention. I welcome the urgent question and the Minister's statement. Can I praise the efforts of the British Embassy in exile in Addis? It's clear we need a long-term strategy to contribute to end the fighting and begin a political settlement. And I just wonder what plans the Minister has to send UK personnel back into Sudan when the time is right, perhaps based on the port of Sudan, until a return to Khartoum is possible.
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and I have to say that the staff from the UK Embassy that was previously in Sudan really did show the best of UK government. No question about that. They were placed in a truly horrendous, terrifying situation at the time of the beginning of this conflict, effectively under siege in the middle of the beginning of a dreadful war. They've shown the best of government, no question about that, and I praise them. I was very pleased to be able to meet with a number of them when I was in Addis Ababa. They're operating obviously out of Ethiopia currently because it's too dangerous for them to be operating within Sudan. I know they would be, of course, very keen to ensure that we do have that presence, but of course we also need to ensure safety, and my goodness, that was really tested previously, and again I praise their bravery in that case.
Liberal Democrat spokesman Leila Moran.
May I congratulate the Shadow Minister for securing this urgent question and you, Mr Speaker, for granting it, because as we've heard, this could not be more urgent. Over 25 million people are suffering from acute food insecurity. That's more than half of the population. In one South Darfur health facility, 5 malnourished children were dying every day in July this year, and yet the plight as a whole has been largely met by silence from the international community. At the Paris donor meeting in April, the previous government did not commit to any additional humanitarian assistance, but just re-announced a previous commitment. So can the Minister tell the House what extra support the new government will provide from now on? And given that the conference itself only raised half of what is needed, the case for even more additional UK aid is clear. But we also need to play our part in securing a path to peace in Sudan as a whole. And given the UK's role as the penholder at the UN, can the Minister tell me what specific actions are being taken to prevent the supply of arms by neighbouring countries? Given the distressing news that a slave market has opened outside Khartoum, what actions are they taking to prevent humanitarian trafficking through the conflict as well?
I'm very grateful to the member for Oxford West and Abingdon for raising these important points. And I would say, first of all, when it comes to UK support in this area, we have doubled the overseas development assistance contribution coming from the UK, recognising the severity of this crisis. That means that I announced another £15 million of vital assistance on the 22nd of August, bringing that up to £97 million. Obviously focused on Sudan, where it's possible to operate. Of course, much of the country is very, very difficult to access, including for humanitarian bodies now, but also for those fleeing to South Sudan and Chad as well. She talked about neighbouring countries. I would mention the fact that there are a number of countries which we would be very, very clear in urging to not engage in destabilising activity. I know I mentioned this a moment ago in response to the Shadow Development Minister, but any activity that is not focused on humanitarian support or on promoting peace is effectively prolonging the war, it's worsening the humanitarian situation, and it's creating a legacy for the future, which will be very, very difficult to deal with. We're seeing large numbers of unaccompanied children, for example, a really, really disturbing situation. So we want that message to be heard loud and clear.
Sarah Chap.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I appreciate it. I wish that this conflict and resulting famine wasn't stopped before it started, and I'm grateful for the Secretary of State's commitment to it. However, when the International Development Select Committee took evidence in April, we very much found that it was a war on women. So can the Secretary of State please tell us what specifically she is doing to protect women from the horrendous rapes that are going on, from the sexual abuse, and what she is doing for the Foreign Secretary team to gather atrocity prevention data?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for mentioning this, and of course she has great expertise in this area, and we're deeply concerned about the escalation of conflict-related sexual violence that we've seen taking place in Sudan since the outbreak of the conflict in April 2023. We've seen reports that I know she will be well aware of, and others in the House, that, for example, there have been 262 rape cases reported over the period from April to August. That is likely to be a massive underestimate of the situation on the ground. Disturbingly, we're seeing those women and girls who are subject to sexual violence in IDP camps when they're travelling, at checkpoints, even in their own homes, when they're trying to get firewood, when they're desperately trying to get support for their families. There are also reports of kidnapping, ransom and sexual exploitation. She asked, what is the UK doing on this? We continue to condemn those atrocities against women and girls. We've called out human rights violations, especially conflict-related sexual violence carried out by the parties to the conflict, and we've done that within the UN Human Rights Council and Security Council, and we're working to ensure that evidence is indeed collected.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The the fighting in Sudan is not just having an impact on that country itself, but also neighbouring countries such as South Sudan, who can't actually export its natural resources. What action is the government taking to try and see if they can open up channels for countries such as South Sudan to be able to export the goods in order to feed their people in their country as well?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for raising this, and of course he will be aware that there was already a humanitarian crisis in South Sudan. I visited the Bentiu refugee camp, which houses 100,000 people and effectively an island of marooned people within a kind of lake of floodwater at the moment. There was already a crisis there. He's absolutely right. The economic prospects have gone even further backwards with the crisis. The main oil pipeline, of course, has been impacted by the conflict within Sudan. So we've been having discussions with international partners about what can be done to try and improve that situation. I had discussions, for example, with the World Bank when I was in Juba in South Sudan about what can be done around economic reform, and I would say there is a role for the government of South Sudan in ensuring that economic reform actually takes place. I made that very clear, that that reform needs to take place, that we need to see strong action. We also need to see elections, and of course that impact of the Sudan conflict is being felt, as you said, in South Sudan too.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Newport Sudanese community who came together yesterday in Peel to open their new community centre, and who I know feel that this conflict and this famine of such epic proportions still goes largely unseen, can I ask the Minister to reiterate again to those who hear such horrific stories from family and friends that we will all do all that we can as the pen holder on Sudan at the UN Security Council to ensure that international attention and actions are not too little and too late, and that crucially aid gets to the right places?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising the important point about diaspora communities within the UK. I also have spoken with many people with Sudanese heritage within the UK who are deeply concerned about the situation at home. There are very, very few people, in fact, I'm yet to meet someone who has Sudanese heritage who's not been impacted somehow with a close family member who hasn't been killed, subject to violence, had to flee, or indeed is in food insecurity. So I pay tribute to the Sudanese community in Newport across our country, and most certainly their plight is not being forgotten.
Sir Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I commend the Minister for having made her visit so promptly. It seems to me that this conflict, judging by the amount of coverage that the conflict in Ukraine and Middle East gets, night after night on the news, ought similarly to be constantly featuring in our media. Why is that not happening? Is it purely because of the denial of journalistic access?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to the right honourable